Okay, Boker Tov, everyone. I think this is our fourth session. We'll continue with the question that we left off last week about the Midrashic interpretation of Rabbi Akiva and why was he criticized so harshly by the other rabbis. So let's pull up that text on the screen and look at it. So this is the text that we looked at. And the frog came up and covered the land of Egypt. And as we mentioned last week, it is very common in the biblical Hebrew to speak of the plural in the singular. For example, when Yaakov says, I have oxen and donkeys, in Hebrew it says, Vayhili shor v'hamor, I have ox and donkey, but it means many. So it's very, very common for the Torah to talk like that. That the frog really means many frogs came and covered the land of Egypt. But Rabbi Akiva says, Tenei, Rabbi Akiva omer, tzfardea achat hayta. There was only one frog. V'hi shritza umil'a et eretz Mitzrayim. And it spawned more frogs that covered the land. Amar le Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah told him, Akiva, ma lecha etzel Haggadah. Akiva, what are you doing in the Haggadah department, right? In the Midrashic interpretation of the text. That's not your department. Kalemi daberotecha, velech etzel negaim ve'alot. Wrap it up and go study the laws of impurity and by leprosy or by death. Rather, what is the interpretation of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah after he rejects what Rabbi Akiva is saying? There was only one frog and it whistled and brought the others. So as I mentioned last week, there we have several questions here. Why is Rabbi Akiva's interpretation rejected? It is not replaced with something that makes much more sense. One frog whistling to the others. If you want to reject it with a logical argument, say that is the grammatical use in Hebrew. You mention singular as the plural. But also, why is this criticism by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah so harsh? Wrap up, you don't belong here, go study the laws of impurities. So there is another situation where Rabbi Akiva offers a Midrashic interpretation and is being rejected. Let's look at this one. This is quoted in the Talmud, Masechet Hagiga, page 14a. And it is based on a verse from Daniel. It starts here, the book of Daniel. Katuv echad omer, korseye shevivin dinur. One verse in Daniel, it says, this is in Daniel 7:9. Actually, it's in the same pasuk. Both quotes are in the same pasuk. In one place in this pasuk, it says, korseye shevivin dinur, which literally means his throne. He speaks, it's a vision of Daniel. He sees a vision of the divine, and he says, I saw that Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days, is sitting. This is a metaphor for God. With his hair is like clean wool. This is a famous image of God as an old man with a beard and white hair. But he's sitting on a throne, and this is like a river of fire that makes the throne upon which God sits. But in the beginning of that pasuk, we read the same Daniel 7:9. Ad di korsevan remiv. I saw that the thrones in plural were set up. So is there one throne or two thrones? It's a contradiction between the beginning of the verse and the end of the verse. The beginning speaks of thrones in the plural, and the end of a throne in the singular. So what is the explanation for that? Ehad lo ve'ehad le David divrei Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said, the two thrones are one for God and one for King David. So in the beginning of the verse, it speaks about the two thrones that are set up, and at the end of the pasuk, it speaks about the throne of God only. Amar lo Rabbi Yosei Aglili. Rabbi Yosei Aglili, who was his colleague, said, Akiva, ad matai ata oseh shechina hol. How dare you? I mean, literally, it's until when are you going to turn the divine into mundane? But it's a rebuke. It says, how dare you put the divine providence together with the mundane? Or in other words, if you say that there are two thrones up there, one for God and one of King David, you are putting King David at the same level as God. And that is not right. Ela ehad ledin ve'ehad letzedakah. Rather, Rabbi Yosei Aglili says, I have a better interpretation. One throne is the throne of rigorous justice, what we call kisei din, and one is for charity or righteousness, which we call today kisei rahamim. So this is a concept that later on became integrated into our literature and liturgy. The idea that there is kisei din v'kisei rahamim, a throne of mercy and a throne of justice, and we ask God to deal with us mercifully and not with rigorous justice. This is you could say, a sort of a theological solution to the question of good and evil. We see that God deals with us sometimes harshly, sometimes kindly. So the answer of some people was to offer a duality. There are two gods. One is benevolent and one is evil. But Judaism says everything comes from God, and God has different ways to deal with us. We perceive it differently. So that's the deeper meaning of what Rabbi Yosei Aglili says. But the Gemara raises the question, Kibla mine or lo kibla mine? After Rabbi Akiva heard the interpretation of Rabbi Yosei Aglili, that we're dealing with a throne of justice and a throne of mercy, did he accept the interpretation of his friend? Tashma, come and hear, Ehad ledin ve'ehad letzedakah, divrei Rabbi Akiva. There's another baraita, another statement where the interpretation of justice and loving kindness is offered by Rabbi Akiva. So this must come after the previous exchange, right? So first, Rabbi Akiva said, one for God, one for King David. He was rebuked by Rabbi Yosei. He said, no, that is impossible. One is for justice, one is for mercy. And then Rabbi Akiva repeated what he learned from Rabbi Yosei Aglili. So you would have thought, good, now finally he's offering something that should be accepted by all. Amar lo Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the same Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who rebuked him for the story with the frog, says, Akiva, ma lecha etzel agada, kalech midaberotecha etzel negaim va'alot. Akiva, what are you doing with the agada? That's not your department. Go and teach the laws of impurity. Ela ehad lekiseh ve'ehad leshrafraf. The two thrones, one is a throne to sit on, and the other one is a stool to put your feet on, the ottoman. So God needs two thrones, one to sit on and one to put his feet on. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah quotes a verse in support in Isaiah 66:1. Ko amar Adonai, Hashamayim kis'i ve'aretz adom raglai. So said Hashem, the heavens are my throne and the earth is my stool, my footrest. And that does not make sense, right? Of all three interpretations, we have three interpretations here of how come we see in one place, in the beginning of the verse, two thrones, and at the end of the verse, one throne. And we have three interpretations. Rabbi Akiva says God and King David. Rabbi Yosei Aglili, which Rabbi Akiva later accepted, says justice and mercy. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says throne and stool, a footrest. Of all these interpretations, the one that makes most sense is that of Rabbi Yosei Aglili, that Rabbi Akiva accepted. One represents Midat Adin, and one Midat Rahamim, justice and mercy. So we must, I think that this brings us to the conclusion, based on what else we know about Rabbi Akiva, about him being the spiritual leader of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and someone who encouraged the Jews to get up and fight against the Romans. That brings us to the conclusion that the rabbis were weary of Rabbi Akiva offering midrashic interpretations to the texts. Because when you teaching halacha is one thing, but teaching midrash or offering interpretations to the narrative, to the non-halachic parts of the Torah, you could produce an ideology, and you can create a movement. And Rabbi Akiva was charismatic, and indeed he did create a movement. So everything he said that was not halacha, even with halacha they argued with him. But now that he wanders from the realm of halacha into the realm of midrash, where he could offer interpretation that will be motivating and inspiring and encouraging people to do certain things, they are afraid of it. So let's look back at the. Let's consider. We don't have to look at the text. Let's consider the first interpretation that Rabbi Akiva offered to the two. Why there are two thrones? What did he say? Ehad lo v'had lashechina v'had leDavid. One is for the divine providence, and one is for King David. So here you could clearly see messianic tendencies, right? Because the Mashiach is going to come from the house of David. The one of the reasons that the Romans crucified Jesus and went with such vengeance against the early Christians is because they claimed that he was the Mashiach and he was the descendant of David. They were afraid of it. Anyone who came with the messianic aspirations was crushed by the Romans. So for the rabbis to have someone like Rabbi Akiva coming and saying that Shimon ben Kozba is the Mashiach, and to speak about King David being on par, being at the same level with God, is very dangerous. They're saying you're creating now a movement, a messianic movement, elevating King David to the highest point, and we don't want you to do that. So Rabbi Yosef Glili says, Ad matay ata oseh shechina hol. You are equating the divine providence with the mundane king. Don't do that. Rabbi Akiva accepts. Yes, Eduardo?
Rabbi, in your opinion, why Roman Empire choose Jesus as a Messiah, once we have other leaderships at the same time, or more or less at the same time, postulating the same post, the same function? Why Jesus?
I don't want to digress too much, but he wasn't the only one. The Romans executed roughly 2,000 people a year. But Jesus specifically was charismatic. He came. He had a movement that people who followed him. He came to the temple and he created a ruckus with turning over the tables before Pesach. Those were the true stories, and they were afraid. For them it was just another person, another troublemaker that they crucified. And for many years, people forgot about him. It was his followers, and especially Paul, Shaul Tarsi, who revived his legacy and adjusted the laws of the Torah to bring in more followers. So, but the Romans were after everyone. So that's why also the rabbis were so afraid of Rabbi Akiva. If Rabbi Akiva now starts a movement, they could attract the ire and the anger of the Romans. And they were right. Eventually, they were right. I just, in parenthesis, I will say that actually will lead to the next midrash that we're going to look at. And it's appropriate also now that as we're nearing Hanukkah, one of the reasons that that Rabbi Akiva and his followers, the Bar Kokhba and all, one of the reasons they thought that they could win the war was because it was that they looked at the precedent of the war of the Maccabees against the Greeks. The Already before the war of Bar Kokhba that took place in 132, there were two wars that failed. The Great Revolt in 67 or 66 to 73, if you include Matzada, 6 years of devastation. And then in 112 to 115, one which is lesser known, called Mered HaTfutzot, the rebellion of the diaspora that started in Kiriniki in Libya and spread to the islands of the Mediterranean, and was also crushed by the Romans. So there were already two failures. Rabbi Akiva was charismatic. He traveled from country to country, converted people, raised money to lead that war, and they thought that this time they're going to win. Looking again at the precedent of the Maccabees, what they didn't calculate was that the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire were completely different. The Greek Empire was decentralized. Alexander the Great went with this mentality of sending his officers to settle down wherever they went and create hubs around them. And that's why at the time of the war between the Maccabees and the Greeks, if you want to be accurate, you have to see the Syrian Greeks. It was the one third of the Greek, one part of the Greek Empire who had its seat in Antiochia in Syria. Another part was in Macedonia and Greece, and another section in Egypt. So the Jews they were not fighting the whole empire. They were fighting the local Greek government of Syria. And at a certain point, the Greeks said, it's not worth it to waste so much money, time, efforts on those stubborn Jews. It was a miracle that the Jews were fighting back. But there was also a logical element that where the Greeks said, it's not worth it. We are going to abort mission and give them semi-independence. But that didn't work with the Romans, because the Romans had a centralized empire. There was only one center, and it was Rome. All the rest of the cities around the world were colonies. In North Africa, in France, it was called Gallia. In Gallia, in Spain, in all over the Middle East, they were all colonies, and they all served Rome. Rome was the metropolis. They're like today's New York, or everybody has to serve them. You grow foods all over the world, and you send them to Whole Foods at Rome. Delicacies from wine, wheat. The Romans glorified themselves. They praised themselves for having what is called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The historians call it Tax Romana. It was really all about taxes and tributes collected from all the colonies. As a result, the Romans were not able to afford themselves to lose even one colony, because they are now a body, like a huge body made out of 1,000 small pieces carrying a huge head, which is this center in Rome. Now, if you pull one piece out, everything topples. If they would have allowed the Jews to have even semi-independence, every other colony would say, oh, if the Jews succeeded in getting that independence, we might be able to do so also. And then you have, Syria, North Africa, Gallia, all breaking apart, which eventually happened. But they were able to hold it for that time. So the Romans poured in all of their force, their soldiers, their machinery into Eretz Israel to finish the war. So that's the danger that the rabbis foresaw, and they were right. So Rabbi Akiva, they are very weary of him, and they shut him down. And it's not coincidental. The words that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah chooses, go back and see what he says. Akiva, he says, Akiva, מה לך אצל הגדה? לך כלה מדברותיך, ולך אצל נגעים והעלות. He says, what are you doing in the Haggadah department? It's too dangerous to let you in. Wrap up your words and go teach the laws of impurity and the impurity of leprosy and death. So most commentators look at that and they say, oh, he picked up those two because they're very difficult. No, he picked those two to send a message to Rabbi Akiva. He says, what you're doing is you're making us a leper, a pariah. We are going to be isolated, or we're going to die. So in other words, he says, please uh, don't interfere with the communal affairs of Am Yisrael. Just in other words, stop with your messianic movement, stop with the war. But it didn't work eventually, and that's why the answer of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is also um, very midrashic, meaning not really interpreting the pasuk. It's more in the realm of fantasy, completely symbolic. A stool and a chair, right? Like the pasuk in Isaiah. And now, if we go back um, to the other discussion that probably happened later, it's the same thing. Rabbi Akiva comes with with an interpretation. There was one frog which spawned enough frogs to cover the whole land. And here also you could hear an echo of what Rabbi Akiva is trying to do. He's creating more and more and more followers, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, don't talk about this. Again, go to the impurity of leprosy and death. There was one frog that whistled and brought all the rest. And he's maybe mocking Rabbi Akiva. He says, this is what you're doing. You're going to try to attract everyone. He says, he quotes the pasuk, the wizards of Paro also tried to do the same because they thought that it was done by demons. So, in other words, what I was trying to show with those midrashim with Rabbi Akiva is that several things. One, just like we do in halakha, is that everything has to be understood in context of the events, of the times, and of who's speaking. And second, it shows us the tension between the rabbis about questions of leadership, of communal direction, and also the great fear about the power of the Midrash and how it could be abused or misused. Now that is important. We are studying halakha, but over the centuries, a lot of midrashic interpretation made their ways into the world of halakha. People are not able to draw the line. Today, in the traditional Ashkenazi Lithuanian world of Torah, there's a theory, and it also affected the Sephardim, unfortunately. And this theory is that everything that is written in rabbinic literature, whether halakha or agada, whether legal or narrative or moral, ethical, whatever it is binding, and it has a divine source. And therefore you cannot challenge it, you cannot argue with it. So in many cases, you could say there's no implication. It doesn't matter. If you think that for example, the refugee from the war with Sodom is okay, no harm done. But there are midrashim that caused harm to Am Yisrael, and I want to share one of them with you now. So here's the midrash. This one appears in the midrash on Shir HaShirim in Yalkut Shimoni. In Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, beautiful love song that appears in what we call the wisdom literature of the Tanakh, and it's a dialogue between, or maybe a monologue of the girl speaking about her beloved, and she describes him, and in certain parts she communicates with a choir called Benot Yerushalayim, the daughters of Yerushalayim. And 3 times throughout the Songs of Songs, she says this verse: Hishba'ti etchen benot Yerushalayim. I make you swear, I want you to take an oath, O daughters of Yerushalayim. What is the oath that I want you to take? Im ta'iru ve'im ta'oreru et ha'ahava ad shetihpatz. Do not, this would be in Pasuk, it appears several times in Shir HaShirim, and she says, I make you swear to not rouse or awaken love until the time has come. In its context, when you read it in Shir Hashirim, it fits perfectly because it's a song, it's a book about longing, about searching for meaning, about searching for purpose, about missing the opportunity, and so it's all about timing and preparedness. And she says it several times, I'm not ready yet. Don't arouse love before it's ready, because then it could be disastrous. So it has its moral, ethical message. But Rabbi Yosef Bar Hanina sees a special meaning in those three repetitions of the oath, and he asks, "Shalosh shevuot halalu lama." What are the three oaths that are being mentioned in Shir Hashirim between the beloved and the daughters of Yerushalayim? So he says, "Achat shishbi'a et Yisrael shelo ya'alu b'choma." One of them was an oath that God makes Bnei Israel take, not to climb the wall. And we'll talk about that. What does it mean not to climb the wall? ואחת שהשביעה את ישראל שלא ימרדו באומות העולם, and one was with Am Israel, he made them take an oath not to rebel against the nations. ואחת שהשביע הקדוש ברוך הוא את האומות שלא ישתעבדו בישראל יותר מדי. And the third one was between God and the nations, and God made the nations take an oath to not oppress Am Israel too much. Rabbi Levi, another rabbi, says there are not three oaths, there are six. Why? Because in each and every one of these psukim, it says im ta'iru ve'im ta'ureru, do not awaken and do not arouse. So there are two actions here. So even though it's a literary device, right? It's flowery language. Rabbi Levi takes it literally, and he says there are six oaths, and he says, what are they? Lo tegalu et haketz, don't reveal the time for the Mashiach to come. Lo tithaku et haketz, don't try to bring Mashiach before his time. V'shelo tegalu sod ha'ibur, and something that has to do with the calculation of the calendar of how to set the leap month and the leap year. So we have two opinions. One says three oaths. This is the most famous one, and another one that adds another three oaths. And in the different reincarnations of this paragraph in Talmudic and later literature, you will find different combinations of the three oaths. But usually what people remember is that he told the Israelites not to climb the wall, not to rebel against the nations, and not to try to bring Mashiach before its time. So how did this Midrash cause damage to Am Yisrael? This I would say that if I create a list of the top 10 paragraphs in our literature, in our ancient literature, that caused damage to the public, this one would be number one. It would be number one. Why? Because over the centuries, Am Yisrael in different communities was persecuted, was expelled, moved from place to place. There were moments of independence. There were Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, had their own kingdom. After the king of Khuzar converted to Judaism, him and his followers were proud Jews. In Morocco, there were instances like that. In Spain, in certain places, Jews had independence. But overall, and especially in Germany and Western Europe, because of the oppression of Catholicism and the local priesthoods, the Jews internalized the message of this Midrash, of saying we are not supposed to rebel against the nations. We are not supposed to try to bring Mashiach before its time. We are not supposed to climb the wall of Yerushalayim. That's how they understood it. So in many cases, the Jews just stayed where they were and suffered quietly because they believed this is what they have to do. And even when the Zionist movement was born and there was an option and an opportunity to migrate to Eretz Israel, Jews refused to do it, Orthodox Jews, because they said, we cannot do it. We have an oath. We took an oath. God says, don't go there. It was less so among Sephardic Jews because Sephardic Jews who lived under the Ottoman Empire, anyway, lived in the geographical continuum of Eretz Israel. So for them, it was traveling, just a matter of physical travel, but not ideological or political problem. But for the majority of Ashkenazi Jewry, this is how they understood the pasuk: we must stay in exile until God redeems us. So even at the eve of World War II, people did not flee Europe. But they would go to the rabbis and ask, should we go to Eretz Israel? The rabbis would say, no, you can't go to Eretz Israel. Why? Because the establishment of a place that was before the independence, the creation of a center for Jews in Eretz Israel goes against the oath that says that you must stay in diaspora. And even after the Holocaust and after the establishment of the State of Israel, many religious movements within Judaism continued with their opposition to the State of Israel. Even today, not only what people know as the fanatic movements such as Satmar and Torah Karta in Yerushalayim, but even Chabad Lubavitch does not recognize the State of Israel. They have a deep love to the people of Israel, but they never, Chabad Lubavitch never participated in the elections in Israel, and the Rabbi never visited Israel, and they do not celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut. So it's part of the same mentality. And I know that some of you might be surprised, but if you ask your rabbi, if those of you are friendly with Chabad rabbis wherever you are, if you ask them, Rabbi, do you celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut? What do you think about the state of Israel? Do you think it's the sort of a redemptive act? Do you think it's a miracle that we should celebrate, and see what they tell you? So now, what happens as a result of this midrash? People.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, sure.
Couldn't it be interpreted as staying within the walls of Jerusalem, like being indigenous to a place?
Yeah, it could be. So I'm getting to the point now exactly of what Daphne raised. Like, if we try to understand exactly what was the intention of the original midrash, right? Was it local, temporal, or was it really meant to be taken as a directive for generations to come? So the words lo ya'alu b'choma actually give us a very good indication of what is happening here, because la'alot b'choma means to climb the wall is usually means to break into a place. So when the rabbis tell people, don't climb the wall to break into Jerusalem. When in our history did we have a situation of trying to climb the wall to get into Jerusalem? That was during the time of the Roman control over Eretz Israel, where the city of Yerushalayim was converted to a pagan city, and it was called Ilia Capitolina. And that city, this is one of the names of Yerushalayim, Ilia Capitolina. When it was declared as such by the Romans understood that the Jews have a very, very close connection and relationship to Yerushalayim, and it was right after the Mered Bar Kokhba that Adrian, the Roman Emperor Adrian, renamed Yerushalayim Ilia Colonia Ilia Capitolina, and forbade entry of circumcised people, which means Jews or Christians, into the city. So, and it could have been even exactly at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So that indication in the Midrash, Al ta'alu b'huma, don't climb the wall, is a direct opposition to Mered Bar Kochva, either at the time that it was happening or immediately after the time that it was happening. And the rabbi said, don't climb the wall, don't try to bring the Messiah, don't try to bring the Mashiach. We're not ready yet. Don't rebel against the nations. All these warnings were particular to the time and place of the author of the Midrash, whoever said it. Did not mean for people to take it as a directive for 2,000 years. He said, you guys, we Jews who live in Israel, near Yerushalayim, under the rule of the Roman Empire, right? Trying to mount a rebellion, don't do that. But unfortunately, it was taken as an instruction for generations to come. Hence, the opposition to the Zionist movement, staying in diaspora, and the devastation of the Shoah. Imagine what would have happened if we would have viewed this midrash as only a temporal thing and not something that people were meant to take on for generations. Actually, in 1929, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Toledan, who lived in Egypt at the time, wrote a ruling saying that Jews must learn to use weapons. He said that we should institute in all the yeshivot, in all the Torah schools, self-defense, carrying weapons, and also self-respect and dignity. And he laments the mentality that stems from this midrash that made many people in diaspora think that this is the ideal situation, to be under the heel of the nations. It was written in 1929 after the massacre in Hebron. He didn't call for an active opposition or fighting. Just be aware and know how to protect yourself. Don't let other people step on you. And imagine if people would have listened to him, if the rabbis would have listened to him in 1929. From 1929 to 1939, tens of thousands of young men went to the yeshivot in Europe. If they had even basic training, they might not have been able to oppose the Germans, but maybe they would have enough, they would muster enough courage to run away and join the partisans. And the outcome of the war would have been a little different. Even if one person would have been saved, it would be worth it. But I think tens of thousands, if not even more, could have been saved. So I just chose several midrashim and the fear of the rabbis of how the midrash could be misinterpreted, and this midrash that was misinterpreted. But the question is raised: what do you say when you speak to a traditional Orthodox, whatever some people call, there's a mainstream Orthodoxy, right? What do you tell them when they say, no, we believe the Midrash is Torah leMoshe Sinai, this is how it was given, this is what we should follow forever. So I want to share with you we're moving a little away from the Midrashic literature to something that was written a little later, and this is a book called Mevoah Talmud, that literally means the introduction to the Talmud. It is printed in the regular editions of the Talmud after Tractate Brachot, in the first volume, after Tractate Brachot, and it's a guide to studying Talmud. It is attributed, as you see here, Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid. Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid, Rabbi Shemuel Levi ibn Nagrila, lived in Spain in the 11th century, and he was a great scholar. But that attribution, meaning calling the book the writing of Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid, is mistaken. It is another Rabbi Shemuel who lived way before him, Rabbi Shemuel ben Hofni Gaon, who lived in Baghdad, and he was a scholar with broad horizons. He also studied Greek philosophy and sciences. It was very well planted in the world of science. And that's, when we speak about Sephardic tradition, and I mentioned that we go all the way back to the time of the Geonim. This is one of them, one of the heads of the yeshivot in Bavel, who encourages the study of logic and science. So in this Mevoah Talmud, in this introduction to the Talmud, he explains he says there are there are 21 different parts of the Talmud. In the Mishnah, and then the Gemara is a commentary. And he says in this commentary you will find 21 different genres or categories of statement. Tosefta, Ubaraita, Perush, She'ela, Utshuva, Kushya, different synonyms for question and answer, but he says each one of them is particular. And then one of them is, as you see here, Haggadah. Right? Haggadah is one of the 21 categories of material in the Talmud. And what is Haggadah? Here he explains, V'Haggadah, V'Haggadahu, כל פירוש שיבוא בתלמוד על שום עניין שלא יהיה מצווה, זוהי הגדה. Any commentary in the Talmud that does not refer to a mitzvah from the Torah is Haggadah, meaning he divides halacha and non-halacha. If you offer me a commentary on a halacha in the Torah, on a pasuk that clearly says a halacha, then it's halacha. If not, it's Haggadah. So the Midrash that we just read refers to a pasuk from Shir HaShirim, a poetic text that has nothing to do with halacha. So therefore, it falls under the category of Haggadah. So now what does it matter if it's Haggadah? He says, Zohi Haggadah, ve'en lecha lilmod mimena, ela ma sheya'aleh al hada'at. It's Haggadah, it's not halacha, and therefore you should only accept and apply that which makes sense of it. So you have to test it with logic. If whatever the outcome of a midrashic interpretation, whatever it is, if it does not stand the test of logic, you toss it away. That's a statement of one of the Geonim, the people who were authorized to explain the Talmud. How can we reject that? ויש לך לדעת, and it makes sense also, שכל מה שקיימו חז"ל, הלכה בעניין מצווה, you should know whatever comes to us through tradition from the rabbis, saying that a certain mitzvah, שהיא מפי משה רבנו עליו השלום שקיפל מפי הגבורה, we believe that it comes directly from God through transmission, ואין לך להוסיף עליו ולא לגרוע ממנו. And that which is halacha, you cannot add to, you cannot take away from. אבל מה שפרשו בפסוקים, but whatever they wrote as commentary on the text. Commentary. כל אחד כפי מה שנזדמן לו. Each one of them as it happened to him. נזדמן, to occur, in Hebrew is from the word zman. It's something that happens in a certain time, or we call the circumstances. So he says all these commentaries depend on the circumstances of the rabbis that they lived in, and that's how they wrote these commentaries. They took, or in other words, they took the verses of the Torah and they used them to deliver a message to their listeners that applied to their listeners in the time and place that they lived in. Like we just saw with the story of don't climb the wall. It doesn't make sense to me living in the 21st century with the ability to go visit Yerushalayim wherever I want, but it made sense to them. And it says, Uma shera'a beda'ato. So two things, Ma shenizdamen lo, Uma shera'a beda'ato, the circumstances that brought him to a certain commentary, and his own deliberation, his own intelligence. So concluding here, he says, Ulefi ma sheya'aleh ala da'at min ha-perushim ha'elu, whatever makes sense of these commentaries, lomdim otam, that we will learn. Ve'ash'ar, and sumchim aleim. But with the rest of the midrashic literature, the rest meaning what does not make sense, we don't rely on it. We don't take it into account. So this is a pretty stark difference between what Rabbi Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon says here about the Midrash and the way the Midrash is perceived in the modern the traditional Orthodox world, even in the modern Orthodox world. A lot of thinkers and philosophers of the national religious camp who say that the establishment of the state of Israel was a miracle and was the divine process, they don't reject the Midrash about the three oaths. They just try to interpret it differently. They say they don't apply today because the nation's oppressed, etc. So they, instead of recognizing that it was something that was meant for a certain period, a certain time, they try to work with it and take it apart by using some legal techniques. So I will leave you like last time with some homework, okay? And this time, I'm going to show you a text, and when I share the video, you could look it up, or listen to the recording, or write it down. Now, here's the text. This is from Vikuah HaRamban, the Disputation of Nachmanides. Nachmanides lived in Barcelona in the 13th century, and it was forced to argue with Fray Paul, with a monk called Pablo Cristiani. He was a convert from Judaism to Christianity, and who claimed that the Jews have midrashic material that supports Christianity. He says in your Talmud there are midrashim that support the story about the birth of Jesus and Christianity and all that. And he says, and so here we read, Fray Paul. I'm just going to read it now, and I'll raise the questions, and we'll talk about it next week. Fray Paul, Fray is the brother Pablo. שאלני אם כבר בא המשיח שדיברו בו הנביאים. He asked me if the Mashiach came already. ואמרתי שלא בא. I said no, he didn't come yet. והביא ספר אגדה. So this Pablo quoted a book of Haggadah, a Midrash, שאמר בו, and in this book it said, כי ביום שחרב בית המקדש, בו ביום נולד, on that Jesus was born on the day that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. ואמרתי אני שאיני מאמין בזה. I said I do not believe this Midrash, but rather I could use it as a proof. But he says this, ועתה אני אפרש לכם למה אמרתי שאיני מאמין בזה. Now I will explain why I don't believe this Midrash. אנחנו, יש לנו 3 מינים של ספרים. We have 3 types of books. האחד הוא הביבליה. Remember that Ramban spoke Spanish. האחד הוא הביבליה. One is the Bible. וכולנו מאמינים בו אמונה שלמה. And this book we accept wholeheartedly. והשני הוא הנקרא תלמוד. The second book is called תלמוד. והוא פירוש למצוות התורה. And is a commentary of the מצוות. ואנחנו מאמינים בו בפירוש המצוות. And we rely on that book and we follow it in whatever has to do with the commentary on the מצוות. עוד יש לנו ספר שלישי. We have a third genre, third category, הנקרא מדרש. רוצה לומר sermones. It's a Spanish word, just like the sermon in English, a speech. כמו שאם יעמוד ההגמון ויעשה sermon, just as if the priest or the bishop delivers a sermon, ואחד מן השומעים היה טוב בעיניו וכתבו, and one of the listeners liked it and wrote it down, וזה הספר, מי שיאמין בו טוב, ומי שלא יאמין בו לא יזיק. And that book, if you believe it, okay. If not, no harm done, meaning it is not binding. So I'm leaving you with this question. Ramban says about the Midrash, he could have used the words of Rav Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon, that the Midrash is not binding. Why does he describe it as a sermon that delivered by the priest or by whatever the speaker, and one of the listeners liked it and wrote it down? I leave that for next week.